The election, though, as you've heard, has been marred by lower voter turnout. Well, to speak about this, data analyst Pranish Desai from Good Governance Africa joining us now here in our studios in Hyde Park in Hyde Park in Johannesburg. Good afternoon, Pranish. Thank you very much for your time. Voter turnout, I mean, it seems like it's a big issue. And even as early as yesterday, as people were voting, there were all kinds of assumptions being made and analysis to say the lower the voter turnout, it would impact different parties. The bigger the parties, like the ANC, might be impacted a little bit more. Before we even talk about that, from a historic perspective, how bad was this voter turnout?
Good afternoon, Dan, and good afternoon to all your viewers at home. So, to put it into context regarding the voter turnout for this election, the IEC, in its 11 o'clock press conference, announced that the voter management devices had tracked around 12.1 million people as having been processed to vote. If that is a correct figure, then we can expect the final turnout figure to be in the ballpark of around 45 to 46%. To put that into the national context of South Africa, that's a much closer figure to the sorts of numbers we were seeing in the 1995, 2000, 2006 local government elections, as opposed to our experiences in our two most recent elections in 2011 and 2016. In the first three local government elections that this country has had, the turnout was around 48% in each of them, whereas in 2011 and 2016 it was closer to 58, 59%.
So it's low, eh?
Yes, there's certainly been a steep decline since 2016.
And we are listening there to some of the residents there in Pietermaritzburg, where Letu Mdluli was, and you were hearing them. I mean, their complaints range from a couple of things. These new devices are sort of mentioned as an issue. People being turned away for various reasons, either wearing their party's T-shirts, which you are allowed to wear, from what IEC has explained, unless you are an IEC staff member or you are working at the station at the time in one shape or form. But there are other factors, and I raised it here yesterday on eNCA. Monday, we've never voted on a Monday, and South Africans will love long weekends. I was thinking, could that have been a factor? When you look at this voter turnout, in your mind, what could have contributed to such a low turnout?
So I think there's some shorter-term factors which have contributed to this low turnout, and some longer-term or bigger picture factors which have contributed. Among the shorter-term is indeed your point about it being a Monday. I think that might well have made a difference on the margins for some people who were sort of reluctant to vote and then just didn't decide to end up casting their ballot. Some of the other shorter-term factors include the prevailing circumstances around COVID, which can't be ignored in this time. That's a factor which has influenced voter turnout around the world, where some international studies have suggested that there has been slightly lower turnout on average relative to what turnout was before the pandemic arrived.
But you look at American elections,
yeah.
I mean, they were very divisive with the Donald Trump factor, and of course, if you look at but I mean, they're in the middle of a pandemic as well, but their turnout was like big. I mean, yeah. Americans different from the rest of the world are the lessons. The pandemic was a factor there, but it did not stop them to coming out in record numbers from what we were told.
No, America certainly experienced higher than normal turnout in their presidential elections last year. But that was also the case quite close to home in Zambia, which also experienced its highest voter turnout in 15 years during this pandemic.
And young people played a bigger role in the Zambian election.
Yes, they were certainly a decisive role. I think that in South Africa, the biggest concern is what direction this voter turnout is trending in.
Could the lack of trust, I mean, all the trust barometers that you read about that people have been researching recently point to a global lack of trust, and particularly in our country as well, people have more distrust now of public political power, of politicians, for example. Could that also be a factor that people just say, you know, I don't have faith or trust in this system anymore, I stay away?
I think that's definitely a factor. What we also see specifically in reference to local elections is that 3 of the least trusted institutions in South Africa are local government councils, the ruling party, and opposition parties. What that means is you have three institutions which aren't trusted as much, which are on the ballot in some way or form. And as a result, you'll likely see lower turnout.
Local government councillors are one of the least trusted entities or institutions in our country.
Yes.
So that could have played a role. But is it, when you have such voter turnouts as low as what we are witnessing now, as the numbers are still being tallied, we'll get the final percentage turnout later, of course. Is it good for democracy?
I think it's a worrying sign, especially the steepness of the decline. And especially the steepness of the decline in the youth age groups, so 18 to 29 in particular. In these age groups, millions of eligible voters are not even registering in the first place, let alone casting their ballot. And what that means is that we have a growing proportion of non-voters in this country. And these are people who are opting out of the electoral process altogether. That's definitely a very worrying sign for a country which sacrificed much to actually be able to gain the ability to cast a ballot.
From a good governance perspective, I mean, okay, regular elections are healthy, they're good, but they are not a sum total of democracy. There are other aspects of democratic experiencing or expressing your democratic life in a multi-party constitutional democracy like ours. That includes civil society organization, as an example. Do you think our young people are beginning to put faith in that going forward and say less about political power?
I think that it's certainly the case that young people are probably more open to being involved in those sorts of activities at this stage. We must also contextualize this as being a global trend, that younger people do tend to vote.
So South Africa is not alone in this trend?
South Africa is not alone. What is unique in South Africa is the speed with which this decline has happened.
And the sharpness of it.
Yes, and that's very worrying. Because electoral democracy is an important aspect of democracy as a whole. And it's one way in which young people can make their voices heard and also apply pressure on elected officials to ensure that they are delivering according to the expectations and interests.
Yeah, Mr. Desai, before you go, last question. If this is what we've witnessed here, could this be a watershed election ahead of the national general elections that are coming up in 2024, which will mark the 30th anniversary of democratic South Africa?
I think this election does have the potential to be a watershed. What's very important for the viewers at home to keep in mind is that 50% barrier. If a party gets more than 50%, then they can form a government on their own. Whereas if they're below 50%, they either have to rely on forming a minority government, which won't be as powerful, or they have to rely on coalitions. In these local elections, what we're seeing, particularly in the metros, where 4 in 10 South Africans live, is that a lot of them are going to end up heading towards, based on the projections eNCA has provided, are heading towards being coalition governments. That's definitely something to watch out for heading into the future ahead of national elections in 2024.
Thank you very much, Pranish Desai, there, for your insights. In fact, you mentioned the eNCA projections. I'm going to be joined by Mr. Yan Joubert, who's been helping us with some of those projections at eNCA in a short while this hour as well, to look at the latest moves around the councils and also zoom in a little bit on KwaZulu-Natal. Thank you very much for your time. Well,